There's an argument playing out at every family table now. One side says buying a home used to be easy. The other says you could never afford a house like this today. And beneath that argument sits everything the debate rarely names: wages, debt, inflation, assets, and monetary policy. Because the home that once meant affordable now carries a price that reads almost like a misprint. Set the old economy beside the new one, and the two no longer belong to the same century. So it's worth slowing down and reading the numbers carefully, without blame and without nostalgia. There was a time one steady paycheck could reach a comfortable family home. Every path of effort, study, skill, labor, used to funnel reliably toward that single front door. Today the qualifications pile higher than ever, the advanced degrees stacked well past what was once required. Yet a paycheck measured in tens of thousands now faces a home measured in hundreds of thousands. Chart the two together, and they don't rise in parallel. House prices climb while wages barely lift. The gap isn't abstract. It's measured in the growing years of work each home now demands. You can work harder every year and still watch the house stay exactly the same distance ahead. The savings jar that once promised a future now quietly raises a question it can't answer. For years we were handed a simple formula: effort, discipline, and savings would compound into a home. And for the generation that received it, that formula genuinely worked because the math was on their side. The promise was clean and believable. Effort would lead, almost mechanically, to stability. But apply the same effort against a far steeper slope, and the result changes completely. Because somewhere along the way, the house stopped being shelter and started behaving like an appreciating asset. And once it did, the ordinary buyer was no longer competing only against other families. A single local paycheck now stands against global capital, international investment, and funds that never sleep. Cheap money was meant to help, yet low rates quietly poured fuel onto the prices. The monthly payment is presented as gentle, while the total price behind it keeps expanding out of view. So the value index explodes upward while the buyer signs on to a number that keeps growing. And the housing market begins to feel less like a destination and more like an endless wheel. The older buyer and the younger one didn't just live in different moods. They faced different obstacles entirely. One met high interest rates. The other meets giant prices. The same door, two different locks. This is where the divide sharpens into something more specific than the warm blur of nostalgia. For the earlier generation, the equation balancing home, savings, and family was simply lighter to hold. For the younger one, ownership sits just beyond the glass, visible, familiar, and out of reach. Surrounded by obligations that don't add up, the path forward stops looking obvious. Student debt often anchors the first step before the climb toward ownership can even begin. And each milestone that once marked adulthood now arrives later, pushing the settled life further out. Meanwhile, the paycheck holds roughly flat as housing costs climb steadily, year after year. So the home keeps drifting upward, just fast enough to stay above an outstretched hand. The deeper problem is simple. Assets now rise faster than savings can ever chase them, which is why an owner and a renter, earning alike, quietly drift toward different destinations. One pays each month and builds nothing lasting. The other plants equity that grows like a tree. Over a long enough span, that single difference in ownership compounds into a gap effort struggles to close. Because ownership was never only shelter, it became the quiet vehicle for security and legacy. When shelter grows this expensive, it reaches into the largest decisions a person can make. As housing costs trend upward, family decisions are quietly delayed, and the birth rate drifts down. People still try to grow something stable, even while the rent stacks up around them. It's tempting to look back and assume the past was simply, effortlessly easier. But every earlier generation carried real burdens of its own: hard labor, insecurity, and risk. Each era balanced its own mix of opportunity and hardship, never one without the other. So calling a whole generation lazy or entitled is the easy explanation and the wrong one. Because productivity keeps rising, yet its rewards increasingly split away from wages toward assets. The gains flow toward those already holding equity, real estate, and stocks, those already positioned as owners. And rising housing prices act like a magnet, pulling the whole market further out of reach, leaving a narrow set of winners and a much wider group pressed toward the edges. When the central bank lowers rates, asset prices swell, rewarding those who already hold them. Underneath sits a quiet mathematics, where an appreciating asset pulls away from the wage chasing it. This is why a home still represents security, a future, and stability all at once. Yet the ladder from effort to stability has grown far longer than it used to be. And so much of what people want most quietly waits on the other side of ownership. The path there now feels narrow and precarious, a careful balance stretched across a widening gap. Faced with a market this large, it's easy to feel small and uncertain where to stand. A single wage can feel like it's meeting a rising wave of costs about to break. Because housing has become a powerful money engine, spinning far beyond its original purpose. None of this denies a simple truth. Every generation has faced real pressure of some kind. But the modern set of pressures is shaped differently from the ones that came before, formed by incentives and an economy where housing sits on shifting structural layers beneath the surface. Ordinary people end up standing on machinery they never designed and rarely get to see. Walk through the decades, and the same effort buys a visibly different life at each doorway. So the honest work is to study what actually changed, rather than who to blame. Because the path to a single key now runs through a blizzard of mortgages, rates, and terms. And it isn't housing alone. Rent, tuition, and living costs all climb at once. So home prices rise through the top of the hourglass, while savings drain out the bottom. And the door marked ownership stays firmly shut, no matter how hard it's pushed. Understanding it means connecting the pieces: wages, rates, assets, and inflation moving together. Because rising housing costs topple into reduced mobility, and then into the biggest life choices. The city itself becomes a prize measured as an asset rather than a place to live. And planning a future grows harder when its foundation keeps shifting underfoot. A starter home that once cost a modest sum is now a tiny apartment at an inflated price. The same four walls are read as humble shelter or valuable asset, depending on which side you stand. And with each step, the simple cost of entry climbs higher than the last. Over a decade, house appreciation races upward while wages stay almost flat beneath it. So the wealth tied to property keeps rising just beyond the reach of the ordinary earner. When a home appreciates that fast, capital flows toward it from everywhere on the map, and the gains land with owners and investors. A story about where money moves, not effort. Meanwhile, the power to approve or deny entry looms far larger than any single applicant. Every decision now swings between reaching for risk and holding on to stability. And a steady economic pressure gets carried quietly, dragged behind almost every household. On the generational ladder, each newer rung starts a little further from the first step up. This is an asset-driven economy, where financial markets, housing values, and profits rise together. And against it, the individual can feel very small before something vast and unlit. Savings progress inches forward while the clock of elapsed time keeps moving much faster. Student debt, high rent, healthcare, inflation, and taxes stack up against a single glowing opportunity. Navigating it means reading a wall of moving markets that most were never taught to interpret. So the paradox completes itself. Low rates lift prices, and higher prices harden the entry, which is why it pays to read the terms carefully rather than the headline alone. Every buyer now carries that balance directly, weighing a mountain of cost against a single home. And the cost of living rides its own escalator, climbing whether or not wages join it. Look between the past and the present, and the same place tells two very different stories. Housing, education, debt, and future planning are all tied into one tightly connected web. So reaching a home can feel like scaling a mountain built entirely out of money. The modern economy rewards and punishes quickly, cycling between innovation, loss, and constant change. And ownership itself becomes a contested move on a board with many competing hands. Seen coldly, a home turns into one asset among many, weighed like any other. None of this is permanent, though. Economies evolve, and the terrain has shifted before. For now, the home sits at the very center of these swirling flows of money. And each of us stands on that machinery, whether or not we ever notice it. The landscape keeps changing around us, old foundations giving way to newer, costlier ones. And the long-term markers of security drift further down a road that keeps extending. So the home quietly dissolves from a place to live into a financial abstraction. Which brings us back, calmly, to the two lines this whole story began with. For decades, housing costs and average wages have drifted apart, and reading that honestly is where clarity begins.